We've got 4 fantastic speakers on the platform. We originally had 6 involved in this session. Unfortunately, 2 speakers weren't able to make it, so we've lost some important regional perspectives we were hoping to have. But what we do have are 4 fantastic speakers, including 3 farmers, and another speaker who works very closely with farmers. So that's going to be a very interesting perspective and such a crucial one in the topics we're discussing throughout today and tomorrow. Before introducing you to the speakers, I'll give a brief introduction about what we're going to be talking about today and why. First of all, my name is Nick Jacobs. I'm the director of IPES Food, International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, and we're one of the co-sponsors of the conference. So in this session, we're going to be talking about regenerative and agroecology and the many solutions that we need to be zoning in on to get to sustainable food systems. These are 2 of many different terms that we hear in these debates: sustainable intensification, nature-based solutions, nature-positive solutions, organic, climate-smart agriculture, many, many more. When we look closely at what people really mean when they're using these terms and describing the future of food systems, there's a really clear distinction, I think, between people talking about tweaking the systems that we have now or really redesigning and rethinking the systems based on different principles. And what I think we're going to be talking about in this session is that really fundamental redesign and what it looks like. So we're not going to worry too much about different terminologies, whether we're talking about agroecology or regen. We're all talking about how to redesign food systems fundamentally. And that means changing how we organize the production system, changing the relationships with workers, with nature, with animals, and with consumers and everyone else in supply chains. So that's the fundamental change that we're interested in discussing in this session. It's a change that's happening all around the world, sometimes at very small scales, sometimes bigger scales, and sometimes difficult to capture all of that change. It's change that's happening, but it's complex, it's challenging, and it faces multiple barriers. So we'll be talking about those barriers as well today. I would now like to introduce our 4 fantastic speakers. To the left here, we have David Finlay. David is a 3rd-generation dairy farmer in Scotland and the founder of The Ethical Dairy. 25 years ago, he started his journey converting this farm, a dairy, beef, and sheep farm, to organic. But the journey didn't stop there, and I won't say much more about it because David's going to be presenting that journey with some slides. But what I will say is that he achieved the Outstanding Achievement Award at Scotland's Environment Business Awards in 2021. So this has been recognised for the originality and the ambition of the transition that David's undertaken. Sitting next to David is Dr. Fritha Langford of Newcastle University. 20 years ago, Fritha started on her journey to this platform today when she embarked on a PhD to investigate sleep in sheep who are being transported by road. Subsequently, Fritha initiated a master's program in animal welfare, ethics and law at the Edinburgh University and SRUC. She's now working as a senior lecturer in animal welfare science at Newcastle University's School of Natural Environmental Science. And through that role, she's involved in hands-on teaching, also farmer and vet training in the UK and across Asia. And she keeps chickens in her backyard, high-welfare broiler chickens, and has a mini food forest in that garden. I'm not sure what that means, but maybe we'll find out by the end of the session. To my right is Nettie Wiebe. Nettie is a farmer and a social movement activist. Nettie is farming in a context of large-scale, very industrial farming in the Saskatchewan province of Canada. And Nettie informs me that her farm is small by Canadian standards, but might seem very large here in Europe. Nettie's the first woman to lead a national farmers' organization in Canada, having served as president of the NFU Canada. And through that role and her subsequent involvement, was able to help build the La Via Campesina movement, which has become so foundational in embedding the notion of food sovereignty. And Nettie remained involved in that and served as the only woman on the International Coordination Committee of La Via Campesina, and has been very involved in promoting women in leadership roles in this space. And proud to say that I work with Nettie within iBes Food. It's one of our expert panel. Finally, we have Seth Watkins. So David's a third-generation farmer. Seth is a fourth-generation farmer. No one-upmanship here, but goes even further back. Farms at Pinhook Farm in Iowa, which many of us know as really the Corn Belt, the heartland of intensive agriculture in the US. So like Nettie, farming in this context of large-scale and often very harmful industrial agriculture, and Seth's journey towards a stewardship-first approach on his farm started with that awareness of the impacts of chemical contamination and the harms of industrial agriculture across that region. Today, Seth's farm has Angus cattle, chickens, sheep, and bees, and he'll tell us more about that. As well as farming, Seth gives excellent TEDx talks. I recommend you to check them out. He's a champion of the UN Food Systems Summit and has been involved in many other initiatives, including the Blue Gap national science programs in the US to fight nitrogen pollution. So thank you very much to our speakers. We really look forward to hearing from all four of you. Moving on, what we're going to do first of all is hear from David, who's going to give us a short 10-minute presentation to talk us through, a 10-minute presentation, to talk us through the journey of the ethical dairy. Thanks, David.
Yep, I'm David Finlay. I'm a dairy farmer from southwest Scotland, and I'm just going to give you a very brief description of our journey into largely uncharted territory of from industrial farming to organic and 100% pasture-fed, audited by the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. There's a bit of placement there. And also we're audited net zero. We are also PWAB, which is production without antibiotic. And we are cow with calf dairying. So we're jumping through a lot of hoops, and I would just like to explain to you...
Sorry, David, could I ask you to speak a bit closer to the microphone and a bit louder if you can?
Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. Just... I'll go through that one again? Okay. We're jumping through a lot of hoops. Right. 25 years ago, Wilma and I were suffering from, I think in the context of the conference today, extinction anxiety, where we really worried about all these issues that were coming at us, as we are indeed today. So we thought, well, we're going to have to do something. And that started us on this 25-year journey to where we are now. This is the farm, the farmland. We're a less favoured area, upland, in south of Scotland. It's a 350-hectare farm, of which 200 hectares are permanent pasture, 150 are rough grazings, scrub covered, and about 40, well, including 40 hectares of woodlands, most of which were planted in the last 25 years, mixed broadleaf woodlands. Here's a view looking south. On the extreme right-hand side is our new purpose-built cow with calf dairy, which we've completed 10 years ago. The green roof thing is actually a micro anaerobic digester, which is a critical part of our closed loop food system. On the left-hand side of the skyline is where we diversified 30 years ago into ice cream and visitor centre, playground, which was a thing of its time, but we've moved on. And in the centre ground, there's some of the buildings there which we are now using for production of raw milk ice cream. Raw milk cheese. Raw milk cheese. It's illegal to produce raw milk ice cream in Scotland. For the folks back home. Okay, so the journey. We said, right, things had to change. What are we going to have to do? First of all, cut out the crap. I think there was a previous Prime Minister talked about green crap, but this is the other stuff. Keep the green crap, get rid of the crap. Fertilisers, 100 tonnes. Weed killers, pesticides, insecticides. Why are we feeding food, human food, to animals, to ruminants on the west of Scotland when we can grow loads of grass? Why are we doing that? So we've got to cut out all that stuff. What about the good stuff? Trees, yeah, trees and ponds. 35,000 mixed broadleaf trees we've planted in the last 25 years. 8 new ponds on the farm. We also stopped all ploughing and deep cultivation, and we only apply composted manures to our fields. What about the guys who are working there? The 2 full-time people on the farm have come from big dairy, where they had 12-hour days, 12-day shifts, 2 days off. You know, they were very stressed, never saw their families, had no work-life balance. So can we give them a good work-life balance? We try to make sure that they're working no more than an average of about 40 hours a week. What about the cows? Sure, we can give the cows better ventilation, more light, more room in the buildings. We can let them out to grass in the summertime. But there's the elephant in the dairy industry room, which is cow-calf separation. What can we do about that? And that's been the final challenge in the journey so far. And of course the question is then, when you've done all that, can you feed the world? And will you remain in business? Well, that's the big question, still to be answered. Then there's the industry pushback. Not many folk like that, because the corporations, they see organic and agroecological farming as a threat, and they will throw the spanner in wherever they can, discreetly of course. At a local level, we've got the vets, contractors, farm suppliers, all the little companies that are supplying agriculture, giving us all this stuff that we're not buying anymore. So yeah, that's not bad it's bad for business. The politicians, that's going to put the price of food up, isn't it? Jobs and growth. Where's the jobs and growth? Maybe we should be making the jobs good quality, technical, skilled jobs, producing food for a healthy population rather than what we've got just now. The academics say, well, we need to attract students, we need the latest gizmos and technology to attract students. The scientists worry about who's going to fund this stuff, because we've got no technological development to show at the end of it. So there's no funding. The bankers, well, we're tenant farmers actually, so the bankers don't like us because we don't have the security. And most of our funding has come from private sources. And the farmers, well, yeah, why rock the boat, you guys, smart ass. It ain't broke, why try to fix it? So that's what the message we get from our agricultural industry is, it can't be done. But that's just wishful thinking. Whereas the informed public say, yeah, bring it on. We get a lot of good feedback from the informed public. Just hope there's more informed public coming along. So what are we seeing on the farm? These are little twigs that we planted 25 years ago. Can you see that? Now fully grown, a beautiful woodland. There's a pond there in the middle ground that we created. Look at the biodiversity there. Compare and contrast that with monocrop conifers that are cropping up all over the country now, in so-called net zero. Look at our pastures, they're now turning into, our grasslands rather, our monocrop ryegrass is now becoming filled up with herbs and clovers and grass species. Soil health. These are what we call fairy rings. They're mushroom rings, the mycelia, soil mycelia. I'm told by a soil scientist, this is a science, our farm's covered in these things. In recent years, that this is a sign of good soil health. So I believe that. What about organic matter? Well, I used to think the organic matter was quite high, about 11% organic matter in the soil. We sample the soils on the farm regularly. And it's actually been rising over the past 25 years. It's now approaching 14%, which is equivalent to sequestering around well over 5 tonnes per hectare per year of carbon. Insects, there's a plethora of insects now. but they're all good insects, of course. And for instance, the dung beetle, there's some larvae. That photograph was taken 3 weeks ago, a sheep dropping just exploding with dung beetle activity. Another insect coming to our aid is the green dock beetle, and that's some of its eggs. This is what happens 2 weeks later, and they're far better and safer than the selective pesticides we used to, weed killers we used to apply. An example of the plant change, you can see our orange-coloured fields on the left there, and our neighbours are green ryegrass monocrop on the right, which looks a lot tidier perhaps, certainly to farmers. And what is it? It's dandelions. You know, dandelions. I used to worry about the dandelions competing with the grass and smothering it out, but in fact they seem to complement it. They're deep-rooted, they're nutritious, they are palatable, they're good for the insects, good for the birds. It's a win-win, and they seem to complement the growth of the grasses, so that the crop yields, the silage yields that we're getting now are as good as I've ever got with fertilizers and pesticides. So I thought, I'll go off piste a little bit here. The success that we were experiencing with organic farming and agroecological farming and the return of productivity, that was what incentivized us to tackle the final hurdle, as far as we saw it, which was cow-calf separation. Could we allow our calves to stay with their mothers in a dairy situation and make a viable business out of it? It's been a struggle, as organic was indeed. It's a whole system change. But, and what we're finding is that when the calves are suckling the mothers for the first 5 months, they're drinking 2/3 of the milk. 2/3 of the milk. And over the whole lactation after weaning at 5 months, we get they are drinking almost 40% of the cow's milk. How's that can ever be a business proposition? Well, the way it can be, and the way it is working out for us, is that the growth rate of the calves is now more than double what it was when we were bucket rearing in the first 6 months. They are coming to maturity 6 to 8 months earlier, which is releasing forage that they would otherwise have been eating, and has allowed us to increase our cow numbers by 25%. Okay. Now, in addition to that...
David, can I ask you to wrap up in 2 minutes, please?
2 minutes? Well, that's good.
It's generous.
You've allowed for that early break. Sorry. So that this is the crunch point. So the suckling action is actually stimulating extra milk production. So we're getting 25% more milk, gross, per cow, from 25% more cows. So we've got 25% more cows, 25% more milk. 40% of that milk is being drunk by the calves, which leaves us with 95% of the milk that we had before. That's how it works. Plus, we've got 25% more cattle to sell. That's how it works. So, it can feed the world. It can feed the world sustainably. Oh, feeding the world. Well, my neighbours say, well, you're never going to feed the world, are you? But let's challenge that one. They're producing 12,000 litres per cow per year, 12 tonnes of milk. Great, 12% solids, 1.5 tonnes of solids. But wait a minute, if you take the amount of food that is going into those cows to produce those food solids, it's almost twice as much, even corrected for nutritional value. So maybe they're feeding Europe, but they're starving the world, in my simple maths. Whereas 100% forage cow requires no human food. Now this is the cost trend line. The top line there is actually grey there, but anyway, that's our cost of production. So over the last 5 years, go back to 2016, and our cost of production was 28 pence. Once we did the cow-calf thing, it shot up because we were making mistakes. We were experimenting. We were hemorrhaging money, seriously. But we're now down to 50. This year we'll be projected at 53 pence per litre, at a time when we're within 10 pence now of conventional industrial farming. And that's just farmers doing it. You know, if we had a fraction of the investment that's going into that red line, which is the industrial model, going into sustainable food systems, just think what we could achieve. I think we could achieve parity in no time. Certainly, I think within, even ourselves, within 5 years, we'll have parity, no problem. Those are cows and calves enjoying the summer sun, and this is really, to me, sustainable food systems can deliver the outcomes that we need in a regenerative, sustainable, safe food system going forward. Oh, nothing finally. We wrote a book, which is available to order from us online or from Mr. Amazon in e-form. So, anyway.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks very much, David. Now, our other three speakers have kindly offered to speak without a PowerPoint. Thank you for that. First of all, we're going to go to Nettie. And Nettie, I would like you I'd like all the speakers actually, to tell me what makes you confident that it's possible to redesign and transform food systems based on the changes that you're seeing in your work as a farmer, as an advocate, and in the world around you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks particularly for the dairy piece. I grew up on a dairy farm, and when I see dairy cows, I long to be back there. Okay, let me just tell you a little bit about our farm and about what makes me, I won't say confident, I won't even say optimistic, because I think optimism requires that you have some data to support a trend line that makes it seem as if this is going to have good outcomes. And we're not seeing those trend lines. I mean, a lot of what we heard this morning solidifies the pessimism around where the direction that we're currently going in. But I am very hopeful. And hope is a different kind of characteristic or a different dynamic, because hope is based on what we can imagine as possible. And what we can imagine as possible can be shored up, and hope can be shored up when we have actual examples of it working, even in small context. And I must say, our farm in the prairie region of Saskatchewan is we farm in a hostile context on many levels. The weather, I won't tell you about the weather. The climate is harsh there. We're drought prone, very cold winters, very short growing seasons, all kinds of challenges. Also a hostile policy environment, and that's global, I believe, which we'll talk about a little more later. But on our small farm, I just want to tell you the kinds of things that we're doing on our farm, which I think give us some sense, just as David has done, that actually we can move it in another direction. We started as conventional farmers, which means we were using chemicals, etc., and decided not long after we started that it didn't make economic sense, but even more importantly, we were very worried about what was happening to our land and the use of chemicals, fertilizers. It wasn't that it wasn't productive, but it is so clearly, as Vandana would say, poisonous on several levels. So we reordered our priorities and decided what we were out there to do was not just grow food, but also to take care of soils, our water. Ecological care was part of our way of had to be part of our way of farming, and that was our mission. So the first thing we did was to relinquish the chemicals. We've been certified organic for more than 2 decades now and have never regretted that. Although we suffered some production losses, at least earlier on, we're very confident that actually the use of fertilizers and chemicals in the long term costs more than they're worth. So let me just tell you a little bit about our operation. How many minutes do I have?
About
3
3
more?
minutes more.
Okay. So I'm not going to tell you the details of what we seed per acre, etc. But I will say this: that we're trying to be as use our resources as well as we can and create as well as we can a kind of circular economy. One of the things about when you grow organic grains, as we do grains and pulse crops, lentils and peas, is that if you're not using chemicals to spray out the weeds, you have a heavy weed burden. And for most farmers, if you have a heavy weed burden, that's a discount, that's garbage, that's loss of production, etc. For us, when we have a heavy weed burden, we send all of our grain through a quick clean, and we take out what is garbage on other farms, screenings, weed seeds, thin oats, the split peas, etc. And we mill it, and then we have a small cow-calf operation. And in the wintertime, because it's cold and the fields are covered with snow, they can't graze, you're bringing them into corrals. Then we feed them hay, of course, because we have hayland, but we also feed this, and it's a very nutritious feed. We fatten beef cattle on yearlings on what is, on another farm, garbage. So if you start thinking about what you're growing and how you use it more carefully, you can, in fact, integrate your systems in a way that everything matters and is useful. Then, of course, we have, as I said, a small cow-calf herd, and they have to stay in corrals in wintertime, so you're bedding them with straw. And so then in summertime, and in the wintertime, they're digesting, and you've got a manure pack. And in summertime then, when that dries out and the cattle are out on the land, then we take and we spread the manure over our land. So we've cycled another piece of the operation into a very useful complement of the farm. Then, because we have cattle on this grain farm, we also rotate our crops. And because eventually you get perennials in your fields, and that really does, if you have a serious Canada thistle problem, then you have loss of production, and eventually it overwhelms your crop. So periodically, we turn that land into hayland, alfalfa, which is both a crop we need, and alfalfa is very good at cleaning up fields because it outcompetes those other perennials. Do you see what I'm telling you? We're trying to, and there are many other facets, but I'm running out of time here. We're trying to think about our farm in an integrated way. We're not just inputs, production, output. We're trying to use our natural resources in a harsh place in such a way that everything has value. So that's an integrated, interwoven operation. It's economically, as it turns out, even better for us than the conventional farming was because we don't have those high input costs. We are better off, we're happier, and we have more songbirds.
Thanks very much, Nettie. Some really inspiring stories from different regions of the world, different types of farms. Now we're going to turn to Fritha with the same question. What makes you confident that it's possible to transform food systems? And how are you seeing that change around you?
Firstly, I think one of the things that makes me really confident is sitting with these amazing farmers right here on this panel and listening to how these farms can work and do work and make changes. And listening to farmers from all around the world, we're finding the same sort of things. So that is the initial positivity, I think, is that we know that farmers in all over the world, in different regions, tropical, temperate, really cold in the winter or really rainy like where I live, they are places where we can do food better than we're doing now. And I think that's very hopeful. The other thing is I think there is a change going on. We know from surveys with the British population that regardless of political persuasion or whether they were Brexiteers or Remainers in the recent, relatively recent voting there, that people care about climate change. They care about their environment. Obviously, there are some people that don't care so much or can't care because of their personal situation where they don't have the time or resources to be able to think about those sorts of things. But in general, people are worried about it and they want to do something that's better. And because I think that sea change of people actually caring now, I think that is going to make a difference in terms of our policy. People are starting to vote. We saw just in the local elections just the other day here in England that people were starting to vote more for Green politicians, for example. So I think there is a change in the way people are thinking. Unfortunately, it's quite slow, and we may come to that when we're talking about the barriers later. But that gives me hope. Another thing that gives me hope is working with students. So I am lucky enough to be an academic where I spend a lot of time with people who are 18 to 20 to 24, and they are a very inspiring group of people because they don't want just to see fiddling around the edges. They want to see real radical change in the systems that we're developing. They want to think about being able to produce food that's going to feed the world, as we keep coming back to, but that isn't just, for example, developing new proteins for pigs and chickens. It isn't just that, because that means we keep them in the same situation. They want to see something different from that. And they're interested in choosing projects for their dissertation things that help them understand and move things forward in a scientific way to a better system. And I think that is really helpful. And I think our students are actually far ahead of where us sort of grey-haired academics are at the moment, and certainly where we see business. So I think actually bringing business in to listen to our students would be something that's really useful. Our businesses are often surprised when we say, actually, our students are really radical. They really want to do something different. So I think there's a lot of grounds for hope and optimism. I think we are changing from a society that's based on economy to one that should be based on ecology. Of course, two words that share the same root. They both come from home, ecos. And so we have a system where we could change from we're just dealing with money to we're dealing with the whole of existence and life, and that should be something that we should celebrate. So I think lots of room for optimism, but we're going to talk about barriers in a minute. We should have done it the other way around so that we felt positive at the end, but never mind.
We'll come back to positives.
We'll come back.
Right. Thank you, Frida. The final presentation in this round, we're going to hear now from Seth Watkins. Same question to you, Seth. What makes you confident that it's possible to redesign food systems?
It's always easier for me to maybe frame where we are to move forward. So basically, modern agriculture has replaced crop rotation, animal husbandry, and common sense with fossil fuel, chemicals, antibiotics, exports, and bad policy. The justification for this madness is we have to feed 9 billion people by 2050, yet the perceived miracle of our finite resource-driven food system is destroying the soil, water, biodiversity, and knowledge needed most to actually feed a global population expected to pass 9 billion by 2050. The hard truth is that in the pre-industrial era, 1 calorie of energy produced 5 calories of food. The current U.S. food system uses 13.3 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. I'm confident we can change because we're out of options, and experience has taught me that regenerative ag works. The way I learned this, and the reason I'm standing here today, is that 25 years ago in the aftermath of a blizzard, I finally decided to trust my gut and stop farming the way I was and the way the experts told me, and ask why I was working against Mother Nature. Until that blizzard, one of the modern practices I applied was having my cows calve in January and February. The ag economist's wisdom behind this was that by calving at this time, I could dedicate more labor to planting corn in late April and have larger calves to sell in the fall. Plus, modern technology had antibiotics to deal with disease, equipment to deal with mud. I could put more surveillance and cameras in my barns to deal with calving issues. And there was a very strong industry-driven attitude that my job as a farmer wasn't to care for the land. It was to produce as much as possible to feed a hungry world. And when you hear that response, it makes trusting your gut very difficult. Now, the blizzard lasted for 3 days, and I filled my barn and machine shed with cows and calves. I filled my house with calves, and we all made it through the storm. But Mother Nature got my attention, and I knew I wasn't doing right by the cows. They were supposed to be doing their own thing and having calves on warm, green spring pastures, not in cold, muddy lots. And I asked the most important question in my career. I asked, why am I working against Mother Nature? And I made a simple change to my system. I changed my calving date from February 1st, like the ag economist recommended, to April 10th, when Mother Nature had the deer start having their fawns. I was okay if the experts were right, and I went broke because of this, because I'd had enough. I just wanted to do right by the cows. Well, I'm still here 25 years later, and I didn't go broke. Acknowledging that Mother knows best actually made my farm profitable by greatly reducing my costs for fossil fuel, equipment, and antibiotics. By allowing the cows to express their natural instincts by calving on warm green pastures instead of cold muddy lots, reduced their stress, improved their immunity, and improved my herd's productivity. So like one of my favorite British authors, C.S. Lewis, says, good things beget good things, and I've been on a journey of continuous ecological improvement ever since.
At this stage, we were planning to have a second round of questions directly to the speakers about the barriers, but we're slightly behind time, and I really don't want to run out of time for the Q&A. You've all been listening patiently to presentations all day, so I'm going to depart from the original plan, if that's okay with our speakers. I'm confident that there are lots of great questions in the room, no pressure. And I'm confident that those questions will also touch on the barriers, because we've heard lots of positives, and there's always a flip side, and there are challenges to overcome. So I'll open the floor. There are going to be roving microphones for anyone who'd like to ask a question. So please put up your hands, and we'll take, I think, 3 questions to start with, and then hear some responses, and then we'll see if there are more. Thanks. So first of all, the lady in orange.
Useful to wear this colour, actually. My question is to both.
Could you speak up slightly?
Okay. My question is to the gentleman at both ends, and not that I didn't love everybody in the middle, but I'm interested in what your neighbours are now doing. Having seen your successes and been around your thinking for what seems to be a reasonable period of time. That's not a comment on age.
Thanks very much. We'll take 2 more questions, and then we'll get some responses. I see the gentleman right at the back holding up a card. That's also a good technique, it seems.
Tried and tested that one. I would like to ask the question. The average age of a farmer in the US is 57. In Britain, it's 60. Japan, it's 67. Kenya, it's 60. We've got some great examples and models of the future for farming. But how are we going to get the new entrant farmers coming in to fit into those systems? I would also say that over the past 3 years, I've been a plant-based farmer. I've used no animal inputs on my farm at all, no oil, just using hand tools. But I'm under 5 hectares, and I just can't get the support to keep it going. So I've had to wrap up and sow pasture mix for horses on good land that's been producing veganic crops of late. So even people like me that are trying to do the right thing can't stay in this business for long. And I'm also worried about where the next generation are coming from.
Okay, thanks very much. And then I'll take one from this part of the room. The gentleman here in the middle with the blue tie.
My question. Thank you. A bit of a contrast to the last one, but I'm a beef farmer myself. So firstly, thank you to the farmers that have spoken here. That's been really inspiring, and a bit of a contrast to what we've heard today from some places. My question as a farmer is, how can I and others like me really fight my corner and communicate in a way that's effective and doesn't isolate the public. Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. We will take more questions. So the first question was to David and Seth, I believe, and this is about what your neighbors are doing. So David, first of all.
Can you hear me? My neighbours are probably hardening their attitude against regenerative agriculture. However, those who are further away and less personally involved are beginning to come to the farm. So we've had already had 2 farm teams come to the farm this year. We've got another one next month, and there's one outstanding from Ireland coming to look at that. And the farmers are bringing the whole farm teams because they feel, and I agree, that unless the team is on board with the project, then it's not going to work. But once the team see the practicalities of cow with calf dairying, then it's possible. So it's going to take a long time, but it is happening. We've been talking about this for 10 years, and the first farmers came 18 months ago, and they've started a cow with calf dairy already. So it's happening in Europe, and it is going to happen, you know, but it's going to take a bit of time.
Thanks very much. Seth, on the same question.
My neighbors are across the board. One thing, a little background on me, my folks actually moved back from San Francisco when I was a year old, so sometimes if we're drinking, they'll think what's wrong with me is I'm from California and not from there. But in honesty, you know, you work steady, and slowly but surely I've had a lot of neighbors that'll come over to my home. They don't want to be seen in public with me, but they'll come to my home and ask me questions. But at the end of the day, you know, farmers, we learn from each other. We learn by seeing. To a certain degree, I think something else, I think farmers offer a big part of the solution, but we're not empowered in the right way in the States, to be honest, when you really take a step back and look at it. The thing that I think would help the most where I live, and I'm going to be pretty direct, if there's funders here, this is where I think you could help and still keep your assets intact. We need scalable demonstration farms that are farmer-led for us to apply this research and knowledge to. And my argument is buying land is still a good investment, so you'd have your money there, but let us come together and see what we're capable of. Put some pretty solid ground rules on it, but let us, you know, show me.
And thanks very much. Same question to Nettie as well.
Yeah, I want to speak to this too, and I know why you asked the 2 men, because so much of what's the resistance is from our male counterparts in farming, because so much of their status in the neighborhood depends on how well they farm. If something goes wrong on our farm, we're partners, but actually it's Jim who wears the insult. No? So that's how rural community is often organized. We feminists are trying to change that, but we're a long way to go yet. But let me just say something about our neighbors, and that is that at first when we went there, when we started this, we had weedier fields, and there's criticism around that. Coffee Road doesn't think weedy fields equals good farming. But there was always some curiosity. But here's the thing that for me was very telling, that some of our neighbors came by and said, can you even grow wheat in the prairie region without chemicals? And what that signaled to me is that there's a very deep-seated amnesia about what we already knew. Not only that people have forgotten, but that it's completely discounted. With industrial agriculture, knowledge in agriculture rests with those who are technologically advanced and further industrialized. And whatever we knew about natural systems from thousands of years of farming is systematically undermined and dismissed. And that's for farmers something we have to overcome collectively, and that's that re-evaluation of knowing something about natural cycles and nature has to be re-embedded in our farming.
You want to come on the same question? Okay, very briefly.
I'm not a farmer, but I have done projects where we've been interviewing large numbers of farmers who have different types of systems. And what we found was that people who were doing something that was a bit different, for example, regenerative techniques, would find that their own neighbours were quite dismissive. but what they found real power in was being able to communicate with other farmers around the world. So if they were, for example, on social media or whatever it might be that allows them to do that, they were able to have discussions with people who weren't just next door, but might be in a different country altogether, maybe a completely different region. And they found that very inspiring and very powerful.
Thanks very much. Second question we heard was about the average age of farmers. Very useful data as well provided. Truly troubling data about the aging of the farmer population. I'm going to put this question to Seth. As a fourth generation farmer, how do we ensure the next generation gets on the farm?
There's a couple of things. First of all, watching COVID, I became increasingly aware of the inequities in our food system. I was lucky. I was raised in a matriarchal family. My grandmother was actually a superintendent of schools before she could even vote for herself in our state to do that. And sometimes it's easy to take those things for granted. But I think that we first of all have to make sure that farmers have access to land. And I talked about this earlier again through funding. There's tools in the states. We have ag land easements that are very important, is another way that we get this done. But the one, and I'm just going to write this how I put it, we've got to aggressively support equity. And I'm not talking about old white guys like me. I'm talking about BIPOC farmers. I'm talking about LGBTQ farmers. I'm talking about women farmers. I'm talking about farmers with the skills and knowledge to work with and nurture the land. And again, we do this by providing land and protecting land for them and supporting them. And the thing I'm the most scared about that a lot of these farmers offer that I don't have is tremendous knowledge. When I get around some of the indigenous farmers I've met, I'm ashamed at how little I know and how much support I get and how little they receive. And if we're going to move forward, that has to change. And that's on us, you know.
Thanks very much, Seth. I'm going to move to the next question for the sake of time. So this is the question about how farmers can fight their corner and get these messages across in a way that keeps the public on side. And I think this is a really timely question, and we heard briefly this morning about what just happened in the Netherlands, where arguably farmers have managed to get some of the public on side, and we've seen a farmer citizen movement win a lot of votes, not in support of agroecological transition, more against some of the steps being taken by government. So how do we, to put the question another way, how do we emulate that support for farmers, understanding for farmers, but bring that support behind this transition that we need as well? So I'm going to put that question to whoever would like to jump in.
Well, let me just start this then. It's troubling to many of us that the farm population, the aging and ever sparser farm population is ever more conservative, if you will, less able to think that we can make these major transitions that we want to make, and that actually citizens are demanding. I mean, whatever we've seen in the farm produce market has mostly been citizen demand for organic foods, for example, and that's my sector. But I just want to contextualize that. I mean, this piece that I said earlier about we're considered ignorant, we're considered what we know traditionally is dismissed. And so there's been a real psychology among farmers of trying to be cutting edge and be with it, if you will. And the more urban society gets, the more marginalized we are, and the more resentment there is out there when somebody from the city tells us what to do. No? Because we've made a lot of sacrifices, a lot of sort of transformations, or made a lot of changes, and for many of us, a lot of investment and huge debts. Made ourselves very vulnerable to be cutting edge, to have bigger machinery, to have more land, to be more sort of middle class, if you will, more with it. And now to be told that actually we want to jeopardize all that because we want something different from you. We've got to work through that. We've got to work with farm populations with our neighbors too, to make it more respectable to farm in ways that are ecologically healthier. And I think as we go into I'm going to quit here, but I think as we go deeper and deeper into this reality of climate change and we understand better how responsible industrial agriculture is for a lot of that, I think that change is very possible in the rural populations. Among my neighbors, they're worried too that they don't have songbirds.
So Nettie was allowed to speak longer because she answered all 3 questions in one go. Let's open the floor again, and we'll take 3 more. So I see a first hand over here.
Thank you very much. Very, very inspiring testimonies. You've mentioned how you transform the way you produce on your land, on your farms. How did you do things differently in terms of valuing your production and selling compared to your neighbors? Any lessons learned or challenges that you experience on that side of the business? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any more questions? Gentleman here in the 3rd row.
Yeah, this is probably...
I was looking at the person in front of you, but please go ahead. We'll take both. It's okay.
Is there sufficient support to help with the capital expenditure of transition? That's obviously different from the US and the UK, but it's just interesting. And where should that come from, if there isn't?
Could you repeat the beginning of the question a bit slower?
Is there sufficient support, whether that's from government organisations or from business, to support the transition to regenerative systems, and where should that come from?
Okay, thank you.
Hello. Thanks for a really interesting discussion. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
My question, I'm Andrew Stark from the RSPB. I'd be really interested to hear, Nettie and David both mentioned they're certified organic. So I'd be really interested in other panels' views on the role of certification schemes and that market-based, sort of linking to that first question, what role they play in that transition to a more regenerative food system.
Wow, these questions are all coherent, so we're going to take one more because they sort of merge together a bit. Any more questions sort of in the middle? I didn't look this way. Yeah, towards the back there, in the white shirt.
Thank you. My question is about, and we heard about it this morning, about the sort of scalability of regenerative farming, and I wondered if the speakers could comment on how they envision this happening going forward. How do we get from small pockets to the majority of agriculture farming in this way? Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm going to keep that last question for the very end for closing statements, and I'll ask everyone to address that one at the end because that was really, really a good way to wrap up, I think. First of all, I'm going to go to David on the question about certification. How important has that been for you?
Okay, the certification, I think, is if you don't have direct contact with your customer, the certification gives the customer the confidence that you are meeting the requirements that they expect. That's the customer's point of view. From our point of view, certification of organic, it was a pain because in the first 10 years, our costings showed that we were actually financially worse off being organic than we were not being organic because of the extra costs of feeding stuffs and seeds and stuff. But what it did do is it created a discipline which kept us on the straight and narrow and got us through the difficult period when you do make mistakes and you get things wrong, especially 25 years ago when there wasn't a lot of technological help. The auditing is important from the producer point of view, giving them clear direction, and the customer point of view, and giving them confidence in the product that when you're close to your customer, it's maybe a different thing. It's then about a relationship.
Okay,
Yeah,
same
I would
question.
echo that. I won't repeat it because that's clearly the case. The other part of the certification has been that it has put us, and this is in response to an earlier question, it has put us in the good company of organic farmers across the province, actually across the country. And because there's so little public research into organics, because the universities are so capped, ag colleges are so captured by their partnerships with the corporate sector, there's very little public funding for research in organics. And being in the company of others who practice organic agriculture has given us a lot of help, practical farmer-to-farmer advice, and that's very valuable.
Thanks very much. Now we're going to go to Seth, and we're going to broaden out to the question about the selling side, the marketing. So we've spoke more about how the production model shifted. Tell us about how you shifted your marketing operations.
To be really honest, I haven't gotten there yet. The practices I've implemented by following nature's lead have reduced my costs. They've reduced my input costs greatly. That got me out of debt, and I'm still kind of scared of consumers, to be honest. I know my goal is to spend the next 15 years trying to make my farm smaller and more diverse. So I know I'm going to have to get out of my comfort zone. And I think there's a Dutch word I like that said veelhoeden, means many hats, and I've got to embrace that concept. So I just have to continue to do things that make me uncomfortable to move forward in this.
Thanks, Seth. Same question to Fritha.
So it's interesting, isn't it, when we're talking about how we get information to consumers, we often think about food labelling, and we know that that's a very difficult thing because there's a lot of labels on whatever it is somebody's going to go and buy, and the consumer might have to think about their own health. They might think about traffic light systems to do with calories or salt or fats or whatever it might be. They might have a carbon footprint label or a flight details label these days. They may also have an animal welfare label. That's something that both the European Union and DEFRA are working on at the moment. So there's all sorts of different labels out there. One thing we know is that consumers often don't read labels. They often buy things that they bought yesterday. They're very habit driven. They also are primarily interested in price. So we have to think about farming systems that are either going to be able to capture people's imagination so that they don't necessarily have to read all the fine detail on the label, or to think about price points. I think it's very dangerous to suggest that we have regenerative farming, say, as a niche. We know that organic farming is around about 2% in the UK. We can't afford to have regenerative farming only being 2% of the market. It needs to be much more than that. But the reason it isn't more than that in the UK is because of price. So it's sort of thinking about that, isn't it? The studies on willingness to pay show that people are really willing to think about different issues, say animal welfare or whatever, within their food items. But when it comes down to it, price is often something that is the first thing that comes to mind when you're giving your money over in the supermarket. So it is very difficult, and labelling and certification schemes don't necessarily translate to the public.
Thanks very much. Now moving on to the question about subsidies. The question was whether there's sufficient support from governments or elsewhere. Sorry, I don't think you said subsidies. Support was the question. Subsidies came to mind. I think we'll go first to David on that question. You mentioned already, look what we've been able to do to close the price gap without much support from governments. Can you say a bit more about that? And what would the subsidies and the support need to look like to actually support this kind of model?
Well, this is a good one. Yeah, I like that. I think, the type of farming that we're talking about here is delivering a lot of public goods. In principle, I object to subsidies, although I welcome them when they come in the post. But in principle, I object to them because it creates a dependency and doesn't necessarily achieve the outcomes that they're designed to do. What I would like to see is that the public sector take the lead in creating a demand. So creating a market for high ESG, environmental social goods. It doesn't matter about food or anything really. I would bring in a transition, 10-year transition to 100% for public sector procurement. And you say, well, how is that going to be funded? Well, I'm getting paid subsidies for having land. You know, that's crazy. It should be about delivering what the public wants. Okay, I'm delivering food, but that's just one item. There's all these other public goods, and if you can deliver the package, then that there should be a reward in terms of a market, a real market, a market that's sustainable, that can guarantee that the farmer, when he is going into his transition of his farming system, will have a guaranteed market for his product at the end. The problem that we've always had in the past is that we come through the transition at a lot of expense, and there is no market. There's no premium, there's nothing to justify. So I'm a believer in the market, but only when the market is properly informed and is incentivized. And I think once the public's set a lead in the transition, and I would tie that into education as well for the youngsters coming through, knowing about how to cook food, how to and to understand where the food comes from, and how it's produced, and the value of that, and why it's valuable. I think the private sector will follow on very quickly, but it needs pump priming. And I think the only people that are going to pump prime it are going to be the public sector. But once we get that going, get a market going, things will happen.
Thanks very much, David. I'd like to ask that question to Nettie as well. What type of support do we need, and who should provide it?
We're not even thinking support in Canada yet. We're just thinking call off the dogs. The agriculture policy in Canada is so oriented to productivism and export targets, that it drives the agriculture agenda and the research agenda and the policy agenda almost entirely. That's focused on producing more and more and more, which is antithetical to taking care of and being integrated and living within the planetary means of your farm. No? So, as I say, we would just like a less hostile policy environment, and that's on all fronts, the trading front, the genetic patenting front, labeling. There's just a whole range of issues that, don't let me go there. But the other thing is that food is a necessity, as is healthcare. We've socialized healthcare, not in every country, okay, but we've socialized healthcare in many of our countries, knowing that that's a citizen right. Food is a citizen right, so adequate nutrition. So if governments were taking that seriously, then we would start to move to food systems that guaranteed everybody either adequate food or adequate income to buy nutritious food. That's foundational.
Thanks very much. We've just got a few minutes left, and I think I'd like to just conclude that we have one question that remains unanswered.
Available that would take the cows and give me some kind of return, because we're not a charity. We have to have a business. We're paying people and paying our bills. That would be wonderful. Our cows are lasting a long time because they're not stressed. We're not asking too much from them. They have a happy life, I think. So no, ultimately they will enter the food chain, yeah.
Okay, coming back to the questions that we had originally, there's one that we haven't addressed yet about the scalability of this kind of transition we're talking about. We've talked a lot about the experiences on your farms, on a limited number of farms. The question was, how do we get this from these small pockets into the majority? So I think we'll ask all of you to answer that question as a way of concluding this session. Please take a couple of minutes each. So who would like to kick us off?
I'll give it a try.
Thanks, Seth.
Yeah, there's an irony. I believe to really feed the world, we have to make our farms smaller. And you'll learn from me that I have a love-hate relationship with technology. But when I flew over here, I learned that I can order a drink at the airport bar with my telephone, and it works pretty well. And I think as we're looking at putting together products with the technology we have, I think that's going to be a tool we can use that I can farm on a smaller scale, that we can still get the procurement to a level that it's acceptable for the people that need our products. But I think we have to keep in mind, as much as we want to scale this up, what if we put the needs of our planet first and thought less about being consumers and more about being citizens in that regard?
So we want smaller farms and more opportunities to get a drink at the airport.
You got it. Yep.
Simple. Natty?
That begins well. I'm never thinking about scaling up. I'm always thinking about scaling out, because I think it's got to proliferate into not only into rural areas, but that sense of what farming and food, our relationship to food, has to be in everybody's kitchen, in downtown London and out on our farm. So it seems to me it's a mindset of how we think about food and the world around us. But let me just say that I think the scalability question will in some ways sort itself out, because the demand and the natural constraints will make us transition, will force a transition on us, and I'm not happy with the thought of that. I think we should decide as reasonable citizens that we're going there anyway, but the other thing about it is that if we had, and I go back to what I said, if we had better policies, then a lot of this could be achieved in a socialized way through movements, and that's, you said I was active in movements. I'm always active in movements and in neighborhoods, because I think this isn't an individual question. This is a social question, so we need social support for it, and that, I think, will lead us to that other thing of smaller farmers and more people farming. The more people who farm, the better we will live within our environments. This thing of extensive farming with everybody living in urban areas and wondering what's going on out there, and sort of a few farmers out there kind of hostile about what urban citizens are demanding of them because they don't understand how much work it is, etc. That divide has to be dissolved, and we have to have more people who grow food, who understand food, and change our relationship to food. And that's movement. That's citizens, rooms full of citizens like this, rethinking it and working together to bring it on.
Fritha?
Yeah, I think following on from that point, one of the criticisms of regenerative farming that has been in the scientific literature and also in the press from people who are generally in favour of environmental benefits, so it's quite strange, I think, is that it takes a lot of labour to produce, and that's a bad thing. That we should just still have farms with 2 people on them, and that should be what we should be aiming for. We should have very, very few possibilities for employment. Whereas I think it could be the case that we could have increased employment on farms, but we need to make sure that those jobs are ones that are well paid, people can feel that they've got career progression in front of them, that they could have a really good life working on farms. So thinking about sort of fair shares, I think, is important here. And we mentioned equity earlier. I think that's really important. Why should it be that the ideal is that farms are run by 1 or 2 people and all of their machinery and everything, and huge, great big farms, when actually we want more people in rural areas to have good jobs? We often see a lot of rural poverty, both here and elsewhere in the world, and thinking about having a good job in a rural area would be a benefit in my mind. So I think that sort of thing is one of the real benefits of regenerative farming is that we could have good jobs in rural environments.
Fantastic.
Get people to pay the right price for the food.
Indeed, a constraint we haven't been able to discuss enough, but thank you for pointing it out. That was, in case people didn't hear, the difficulty in getting people to pay what it costs for sustainably produced food. The final word goes to David.
Yeah, well, I come back to the public sector again, I'm afraid. But it's happening in Europe. You know, in Europe, the number of cow-calf dairies is expanding rapidly because there is support from government at policy level to encourage and incentivize a more regenerative farming systems. And we unfortunately we don't have that mentality over here at this moment in time. But we don't have a lot of time left, and it's being left entirely to the private sector to get the thing moving, and we know where we need to go, but it's not going to happen soon enough without public sector leadership, and we just don't have that leadership here at all at the moment. But it could be there. It could be there. I think we know in Scotland we have a proportional representation. And we have, I think, something like eight green MSPs. Not that I'd want the MS Greens to be running the country, to be honest, but what they do is they green up the main party's programmes quite substantially. And that's lacking in the UK. There's only one member of Parliament out of 600. 8 out of 125 in Scotland. So. And I believe that in England there is a much more greener attitude than there is actually in Scotland. So you could have had 70 or 80, so we could have had 70 or 80 green MSPs in Westminster, and what that would do to the attitude of the government. So it's a political thing, it's political leadership, there's a lack of it, and I largely blame our so-called democracy.
Thanks very much, David. Thanks to all the speakers for answering that difficult question so fully. That brings us towards the end of our session. I'm really sorry we didn't have time to take more questions from the audience, but the ones that we did take were fantastic and I think enabled us to get into that discussion about the barriers. When I started taking notes, I had just a small section for barriers and a big section for opportunities. They're now about the same size. So I think that's probably a fair assessment of where we are, and I think we had a really interesting mix of challenges. Some of these, huge questions like changing the voting system, changing gender norms, and the kind of hostile policy environment. But we also heard about some real opportunities on the ground and some things that are changing and can change further. So thank you very much to our speakers. There's now a coffee break, and then we'll be rejoining the plenary at 4 o'clock. Thank you.